Okay, chapter 23 is on circulation. So, how does gravity affect circulation? Well, for land animals, we have to get our blood from our toes to our head. And so, when you look at something like a giraffe, obviously they have to do a lot more work to do that, and hence they'll have larger hearts than an equivalent animal that isn't as tall but the same size. Snakes have that issue because their heart is higher up in their body. It's closer to their head, so they have to do the full loop as well. That heart has to work hard enough to get the blood to circulate everywhere. Most animals have a circulatory system. That means that they're going to transport O2 and nutrients to cells and take away CO2 and other wastes. So any complex large animal is going to require a circulatory system. The circulatory system of land animals has to deal with gravity. You know, when you're floating in water, gravity isn't such an effect, but when you're on land, it's a greater effect. Circulatory system connects all of the body tissues. So we're going to get oxygen to all of the tissue and remove CO2. And if you look at these capillaries, we actually get our red blood cells down to a single file line. And that way, oxygen can just diffuse out to the surrounding cells and CO2 can diffuse in. But they actually get all the way down to single file there. All right, so here's a view of the capillary where we're going to have the diffusion of molecules. You're going to have it in interstitial fluid and obviously next to some tissues. So the capillary is actually going to be epithelial cells. You're going to have red blood cells, again, down to single file, and you are going to have simple osmotic pressure pushing some stuff out as well as blood pressure, and that's blood pressure is pressure from the heart. That will give some pressure there and allow the stuff to diffuse out. By the way, what stuff that could be can be things like carbohydrates, ions, different vitamins, and that kind of thing, as well as things like hormones. All right. There are several types of internal transport in animals. The cnidarians and flatworms have a gastrovascular cavity. So it's much more open, and they can just take in stuff. It's a more open system, and it is both digestion and internal transport. So they combine it, kind of an interesting thing. All right, then you have something that's called an open circulatory system or a closed system, which means all of our blood stays in piping, you know, either a vein, an artery, a capillary. But there are open systems where things mix, and it'll mix with the interstitial fluid. Your insects, for example, it's going to pump. It has a heart. It pumps, but it's open-ended, and it goes to the tissue, but it just kind of diffuses around in the tissue with the other fluid. A closed circulatory system is what we have, and the heart pumps blood through the arteries and capillaries, and then the veins return it to the heart. So everything stays within some plumbing there. All right, vertebrate cardiovascular system reflect evolution. So in a fish, you have a very simple two-chambered heart. It's just going to take it to the heart, to the gill capillaries, where it's going to pick up oxygen. Then it goes to the systemic capillaries, where it's going to go to the tissues of the fish, and then back around. Very simple, and again, the fish heart doesn't have to fight gravity. It just has to move blood around. Land vertebrates are more complicated. We have to fight gravity. We're going to have a separate pulmonary, and that means separate to the lungs, system of circulation, and then we're going to have a separate systemic circuit. So that means to all your tissue. We're going to have one loop that's just for the lungs, and another loop that hits all of our tissues. Amphibians and reptiles have a three-chambered heart, and if you look in the middle, you get some kinds of mixing of blood there. This is not as efficient. Not such a big deal because in amphibians, the skin also respires. It also takes in oxygen and gives off CO2. Their skin is moist, so not only do they have lungs doing this, they have their skin doing this. So for them, it's not such a big deal that you get a little of this mixing. It's not a perfectly closed system. You can see in the middle of the heart, that purple area is a mixed area. Mammals and other things that have the four-chambered heart, we're not going to have any mixing. We don't breathe at all through our skin. By the way, the pulmocutaneous circuit here just means lungs and skin combined. Okay, so your birds and mammal have a four-chambered heart. And here we're very careful with the blood. We don't mix it. We take it from the lungs to the heart, to the rest of the body, back to the heart, and then back to the lungs. Human heart and cardiovascular system are typical of mammals. All right, it has a thin-walled atria that pumps blood into the ventricles, and it has a thick-walled ventricle that pump blood to the other body organisms. So really, it's the ventricles that do the hard work here. The atria just does a little pump and gets it into the ventricles. But when you feel that blood pressure, that thump, that big loud thump is the ventricle doing most of the work. All right, so let's see if we can follow the blood flow here. So if we look at the, let's actually start in the right atrium just for fun. So let's start here. All right, so here we are, right atrium. And if you look here, this blood is blue, and that in the diagram means it is low in oxygen. And I started here for a reason, because we're going to go into the right ventricle. But from there, we are going to go into something called a pulmonary artery. And it's an artery because it's leaving the heart. But it's the only artery in the body that carries blood low in oxygen. And that's because it's going to the lungs, right? So here we go to the lungs, and then we're going to come back in a pulmonary vein, and this is now red. It is now highly oxygenated blood, but it's in a vein. So these are the two that are reversed from the rest of our body, where we think of arteries always carrying the red blood and veins always carrying the less oxygenated blue blood. In this circuit, that is reversed, and that's because the lungs are the ones doing the oxygenating of the blood. And then we're going to go back to the heart, to the left atrium, left ventricle, and this takes it to the rest of the body. So now when we leave here, we're going to be oxygenated blood, and we're going to be high pressure blood from the heart. This thump, this, heart here is going to pump it all the way to the rest of the body, and it will go it'll go up to the capillaries of the head, chest, and arms, or down. The aorta is the biggest artery in your body, and if it goes down, it's going to hit the lower part of your body. When it returns, it's going to be in the inferior vena cava here, and that inferior doesn't mean less or something. It just means the lower one, the lower part of your body. If it went from the aorta up, it'll return in the superior vena cava, which again doesn't mean it's better. It just means it's the higher one. All right, and then back to the heart, and then we do that all over again. The structure of blood vessels fits their function. So when we look at arteries and veins, they're going to be a little different. They're going to be a single layer of epithelial cells to form the walls of the capillaries, and that's because we want diffusion of stuff to occur there. When we look at the arteries on the left side here, you're going to see they are thicker. They have a thicker, smooth muscle around them, and that's because arteries tend to be high pressure, tend to have high pressure blood in them. The veins tend to be low pressure, and they have valves to make sure you don't get backflow, because it's such low pressure. We wouldn't want things going backwards and pulling in like your lower legs or something. We want the blood to make it back to your heart. And so the veins, because they're low pressure, right? The blood has just gone through the capillaries. It's been very low pressure there. Now it's collecting in the veins. We don't want it to collect and pool. We want it going one direction. So veins actually have little valves in them to make sure that it goes in the correct direction. And then you have the capillaries, which are going to be very thin, again, all the way down to one red blood cell. It's going to make things go single file so that diffusion can occur there. All right, the heart contracts and relaxes rhythmically. And so you have something called diastolic pressure and systolic pressure, or diastole, and that is when the blood flows from the veins into the heart chambers. So this is sort of the relaxed version of the heart. And then you have systole, which is the contraction. And there's actually two systoles. You have the atria push into the ventricles, and that's when you listen to your heart, you'll hear a thump, 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 thump. That first little thump is the atria contracting. Then that stronger contraction is the ventricles, and that's going to get the blood really flowing. It's either going to go to the lungs or it's going to go to your whole body. But that's the larger of the thump thump you hear. That's systole. That second one is the ventricle. All right, here's your cardiac cycle. You have the AV valves are open, blood flows in, and then we're in diastole there. Then we move around to the right, and you see the atria contract, and it's going to shove the blood into the ventricles. The valves close so that they can't get backflow, and then the ventricles contract and open the valves that take it to the body. So the valves between the atria and the ventricle close, and they open the valves to the rest of the body. So when the ventricles give that nice strong contraction, the blood goes flying out to the rest of your body. Okay, cardiac output is the amount of blood per minute pumped into the systemic circuit. So that's how well you're oxygenating your whole body, basically. And the heart valves prevent backflow of blood. So you saw those valves, they open and close according to what is getting contracted. Okay. Then in your heart, you have a little area called the pacemaker, and it's on the right atrium, and this is what generates a little electrical signal that keeps your heart pumping in the right rhythm. It triggers the contraction of the atria, which is the first contraction. It then relays this signal to the AV node, which is right in that wall between the two. And there's a slight delay there, and that slight delay is good because we want the atria to contract first, and then it'll go to the AV node, which will then stimulate the ventricles to contract next. So it's a nice delay system. First, the SA node signals the atria. They contract. The signal is delayed as it goes to the AV node in the wall, and then that signals the ventricles to contract. All right, if you need an electrocardiogram, it records the electrical changes in the heart. So it's going to follow the heart rate. That's, the typical graph you guys see when the TV series wants to show somebody's dead. And your heart rate adjusts to body's needs. So you work out, your heart rate will increase. Okay, what's a heart attack? A heart attack is damage to the cardiac muscle. And usually it's from a blocked coronary artery. So you get blockage. That part of the heart actually dies because it's not getting blood. And when we say a blocked artery, we're talking about these are the arteries that feed the muscle of the heart themselves. This isn't pumping it to the rest of the body. This is what supports the heart. And if you end up with a blockage, you can see the little blockage there near the bottom of the heart. That whole area that would be fed by that artery dies, and that's a heart attack. I think it kills about a third or so of the people who have a heart attack, but other people end up with damaged hearts. The people who survive, obviously. Okay. When we look at atherosclerosis, it is plaque developing in the inner walls of the arteries, and that is what can block blood flow. So you can see on the left you have a nice open artery, and on the right it has very much closed off. Now there's different things they can do to help open that up. They can actually stick like a little balloon in there and kind of plumbing, just kind of open that artery up. If it's really bad, you can do bypass surgery and actually replace the pieces but plaque buildup is, bad. Ways of preventing it would be, a healthy diet and exercise, keep your blood pressure reasonable, all that kind of stuff will help prevent plaque buildup. Blood exerts pressure on the vessel walls. So your blood pressure is the force of blood that it exerts on the vessel walls, and that's from your heart, right? So your heart pumps, and that push is blood pressure, and it puts pressure on your arteries, not on the veins, but on your arteries, so that it goes through the rest of the body down to the capillaries. Blood pressure, is in the highest in the arteries and lowest in the veins. And so if you think about it, that obviously makes sense. You have the arteries carry blood away from the heart and the veins carry it away from the tissue. Well, what happens in the capillaries is there's virtually no pressure at all. It comes down to osmotic pressure to the point where fluids can actually flow back into the capillaries, which is very low pressure. And then we have, it's actually muscle tissues that surround the veins that give them any pressure at all. I mean, you wonder, if you look right here on this, why does it rise at all? It's because there's muscles surrounding your veins, but you would almost think there'd be no rise, because here in the capillaries, we've gone down to virtually no pressure to allow for diffusion. Okay, the pressure is the highest right out of the heart, which would be the aorta. Okay, muscle contractions and one-way valves keep blood moving through the veins to the heart. So here's your vein, again, low pressure, but we have to get the blood back to the heart. And so you have skeletal muscle on the outside of your veins, and that's going to keep the blood flowing in the correct direction. So taking your blood pressure can reveal cardiovascular problems. It's a pretty simple idea. The typical blood pressure cuff. Stick it on, and the first thing it'll do when it's really, really tight is it'll close off all the blood flow to your lower arm. The artery, vein, everything gets closed off. Systolic, diastolic, everything's closed, right? Not for very long, though, don't worry. And then as you start to release the pressure in the cuff, the diastolic won't come through, but the systolic will make it through. So you start to hear a irregular flow of blood, and then as you totally release the pressure in the cuff, the sound stops because both the diastolic and the systolic is coming through. Hypertension can be a serious cardiovascular problem. You don't want to be above 140 on the top end or 90 on the bottom end. So you want something like 120 over 70 is a typical adult blood pressure. Okay, smooth muscle controls the distribution of blood. So what it can do is constrict these arterioles and the precapillary sphincters and controls where the blood goes. So you always have a thoroughfare channel through the capillaries where blood can go. And on either side of that thoroughfare, right here, you can see there are these sphincters that can either allow blood to go to these capillaries or not allow blood to go through these capillaries. And so, like, if you were to go exercise really, really hard, you wouldn't be digesting your food. Your blood would go to your muscles. So all the little capillaries around where your food gets digested would just close off, and that would kind of shunt blood to where it needs to go. That's why if you eat a big meal and you go exercise, that food kind of just sits there and it doesn't really digest because there's no blood going there. It's also why I say don't have a huge, huge breakfast right before you take a big test, because the blood goes to your stomach to digest the food. These will open up and allow blood flow, and your brain pretty much needs a constant large supply of blood to stay awake. So the brain usually has a good blood flow. Liver usually has a good blood flow. But your muscles and your digestive system, it's optional. So sometimes it'll close off and stop it, but you'll still have this thoroughfare channel open. but all the capillaries aren't supplying blood when it's not necessary. Okay, capillaries allow the transfer of a substance through their walls. So that little area, again, is one red cell thick. So you have a little area that's open, you have the interstitial fluid, and then you have the nucleus of the epithelial cell, which I think you guys saw in the slides is pretty large compared to the cell. And then you have the cleft between the two epithelial cells, and that allows things like carbohydrates to go through into the interstitial fluid, but it doesn't allow a whole red blood cell. It allows small stuff, maybe not even a whole protein, but other things can scoot through that little cleft there. Okay, transfer of material between the blood and the interstitial fluid occurs by diffusion. So when it first enters the capillary, it still has some blood pressure behind it, and the osmotic pressure is pushing against it. So if you look here, you can see there's the blood pressure is in this capillary. It's pushing out. It's pushing things out. And the osmotic pressure is coming in. And as it goes down this way, there's less blood pressure because it's been in the capillary. We've put it down to one red blood cell, single file. And there's more osmotic pressure, and so things can diffuse into the capillary and then go off to the veins. Okay, blood pressure forces fluid out of the capillary at the artery end of it where it's just come in, and osmotic pressure draws fluid at the end. So that's what you saw in the diagram that we just passed, is that the blood pressure forces fluid out, and then at the end osmotic pressure has it come in. Okay. Blood consists of red and white blood cells suspended in the plasma. Plasma is mostly water. It's kind of a straw-colored fluid that has some solvent, some carbohydrates, stuff like that. It has ions and proteins for osmotic balance. It also has proteins to help with clotting. So if you cut yourself, the proteins are going to help with that as well, and for immune function. Okay, you have red blood cells, the erythrocytes, and they transport oxygen bound to hemoglobin. And that's pretty much their job. The hemoglobin can take CO2 back a little bit, but their job is transport. Then you have the white blood cells, and that's pretty much fighting infection and cancer, both. The white blood cells can do some pretty cool things. We'll go into in the immune system later, but they can actually seek out precancerous cells and destroy them, as well as infections. Oh, and you have at the bottom there, you have the platelets, and that is what helps with the blood clotting along with the proteins. Okay. Too few or too many red blood cells can be unhealthy. Either way is bad. Anemia is an abnormally low amount of hemoglobin or red blood cells, and a person who's anemic can actually need iron shots and stuff to help out, but they're going to be tired, they're not getting enough oxygen, pale very often. If you pull down like right under your eye, you'll see the blood, it comes right up to the surface in the capillaries, right under your eye. If you pull your skin down there and look, and people who are anemic will have almost white there instead of having that nice red color. There's a hormone, the erythropoietin, regulates the red blood cell production. So if you need more red blood cells, that helps with regulating that. Some athletes do something called blood doping to increase their red blood cell production. Not a good idea. It's also pretty much illegal in all of the major sports. So, okay, blood clots, plug leaks where blood vessels are injured. So not only do you have the platelets that are cells in there, but you also have this fibrogen, which will turn into fibrin. It'll actually grab more platelets and hold them at the place where the blood vessel is damaged and form a clot. So the protein will kind of hold on to these platelets, form like a little mesh almost. Okay, here's the blood blood clotting process. So you have an injury, you have a cut. The platelets adhere to the exposed connective tissue, so the platelets come and they start connecting it, but obviously you're bleeding out there. Eventually you're going to get a plug, and then the fibrin comes along and it traps them and it holds those platelets in its spot, like a little mesh holding on to them. Stem cells, if you look at things like cancer, stem cells can cure things like leukemia. So stem cells divide in the bone marrow and are used to produce all the blood cells and can treat some blood disorders. Leukemia, I'm not sure about lymphoma, but I know for leukemia they can do bone marrow transplant. And what's kind of cool about getting the bone marrow transplant is that is transplanting the stem cells itself, so that if you look at the DNA of the blood of the person who had a bone marrow transplant, they actually have the donor's DNA in their blood, not their own. I don't recommend it for committing crimes because it's way too complicated to get a bone marrow transplant, but somebody who's had one will bleed the DNA, essentially, of their donor, not themselves.